left off talking about last class was Louis the 15th. I mean, he makes up the majority of the 18th century rule of France, the 1700s, right? And I think I mentioned to you that Louis the 15th, he lives until about the mid 17 early to mid 1700s. I think he dies in about 1774, roughly. And we've talked about Louis the 15th several times now as being a guy who kind of attempts to be absolutist in the end of his reign, but the majority of his reign is really a drop in the prestige of the nobility, or of the monarchy rather, because the nobles end up gaining more power during his reign. Towards the end of his reign, after all the Madame de Pompadour stuff and all that, towards the very end, in his last 4 or 5 years, what he does is he tries to kind of regain control, because he realizes that France is in a very precarious economic position, unstable. And so what he does is he abolishes the Parlement, and creates this new docile parliament, which was basically the beginning of taxation of nobles, which they needed to do because France was in such a tough spot. This was a highly criticized maneuver, and he did it at the end of his reign because he knew that he probably didn't have many years left, and so he thought to himself, what the heck, I'm just going to tax these guys and whatever. Well, the way that he gets that done is he appoints a chancellor by the name of René de Maupeou, Maupeou, to reduce any kind of judicial opposition that he would have encountered. Well, this was all very short-lived. So this docile, harmless parliament, all of that Maupeou, all of it goes out the window when Louis the 16th takes over. And I mentioned to you before that Louis the 16th dismissed Maupeou, and he reinstated the Parlement of Paris, which he did, of course, to gain the favor of the nobility, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that he is weak, and he is unable to come up with the solutions to fix France and its economy, more importantly. I mentioned also in class the last time that I was there that Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette are extravagant spenders. They spend inordinate amount of money on all sorts of different things, mainly just kind of living the life over at Versailles. And Antoinette, being that she is, the sister of Joseph II, meaning she's Austrian, isn't very well liked by the French in the first place, just by way of the fact that she's Austrian. But beyond that, she's seen as completely, unaware, or at least unwilling, to deal with the economic crisis that's crippling the majority of the population. And we talked about some of these problems that France had. One of them, of course, was the fact that, they have a booming population and all of these crop shortages, which is resulting in famines, where there's not enough food to go around, not enough bread to feed the people. Then, of course, you've got a lot of heavy taxation, particularly on the peasants, but also on the bourgeois class. And the bourgeoisie, get this, they literally cut France off. After the War of American Revolution, they were already in debt from the 7 Years' War. And then towards the end of the American Revolution, about 1779, they decide, okay, well, we're going to help out the Americans and the Native Americans in fighting for their independence from the British, for really no other reason than we hate the British. And the bourgeois creditors, the people who give out money, the loans, they stopped lending money. They literally, they cut France off. The country of France has extended its debt. Now, it's one thing if you're a person and you've got a credit limit for your credit card or something, and you go into the store and you've maxed it out. Well, you maxed out your credit, 15,000. That was you can't go over that. This is a country. The country of France has maxed out its credit. I mean, we are talking about substantial amounts of debt, substantial amounts. so much that they get cut off. That's a problem, because they don't have a central banking system the way that England has. Remember that England stole that idea from the Dutch back in the late 1600s. Now, matters worsen. Basically, Louis is caught between a rock and a hard place, Louis the 16th. He's a relatively young king. He has not won over the affection of the population. He does have the affection of the nobles for getting rid of that docile parliament and reinstating the Parlement of Paris, which meant that they were no longer being taxed. But that's about the only group of people that really supports him. Then he suggests calling a meeting of something called the Estates General. The Estates General. And what this did was it basically it's like a medieval lawmaking body, right? And it hadn't been called in like almost 2 centuries, like 175 years or something to that effect. And they decide to call together. Louis the 16th says, we got to call together the Estates General. We're going to get the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. We're all going to get them together, and we're going to have a meeting. And what we're going to vote on is, should we institute taxation on the nobility, okay, on the second estate? Well, of course, the problem with this idea is that there's a couple of design flaws in the Estates General. Here's the way that voting works in the Estates General. You have your delegates. Delegates are simply representatives, right? They represent the estate that they are a part of. So you have delegates come from the first estate, you have delegates come from the second estate, and you have delegates come from the third estate. Well, of course, because the first and second estate only make up about 3% of the population, you can imagine which estate has the most delegates. Clearly, it's going to be the third estate. But when they do the voting in the Estates General, they don't vote based on the number of delegates that show up. What they do is they vote on the estate. So in other words, there's just 3 votes to tally. The first estate vote, the second estate vote, and the third estate vote. Now, let's think for just 2 seconds about how this is going to pan out. Okay? The first estate is a privileged estate. The second estate is a privileged estate. So they're always going to, more or less, vote in accordance with one another. The third estate is the one that doesn't have privileges. And of course, they're always going to get outvoted by the first and the second estate. So, when the idea is proposed by Louis the 16th, let's call together the Estates General. We'll have a vote. We're going to do it the old medieval fashioned way. What happens is people from the third estate say, we know how this game goes. You guys call together the third estate, the second estate, and the first estate. We get outvoted because the first and second estate don't ever want to pay taxes, and then everybody goes home and thinks that there was justice done. So what we ought to do, people from the third estate say, what we ought to do is vote based on the number of delegates, not based just on 1 vote per estate. And there's this whole hubbub about all that stuff, and basically what happens is Louis the 16th says, no. We're going to do it the way that it's always been done. We're going to vote for 1 vote per estate. So they decide to meet in May of 1789. Okay? So this is now several years after the American Revolution. And, in America, we're, worrying about the Constitution and all that sort of stuff about this time. And this meeting occurs on Cinco de Mayo, May 5th of 1789. So, they called together the Estates General. And what happens was, they were instructed to complete a list called the Cahiers des Doléances. And the Cahiers des Doléances is I know that's a weird thing, it's a French term. It's basically a list of complaints. And so each estate is instructed to compile a list of suggestions and grievances and present these to the king. Well, basically, the agreement among the estates is that, first of all, France should be a constitutional monarchy. All estates agreed on that. All estates agreed that individual liberties should be guaranteed by law. All estates that the position of a parish clergy should be improved. The position of the parish clergy should be improved. And then D, the final thing that they all agreed on is that internal trade barriers, which there were a bunch of, should be eliminated. Basically, the way that I don't want to get into all of it, but basically France was made up of a number of different like districts and counties and stuff, and they had tolls between all these places. So just to transport something across France alone would have cost an arm and a leg, because there's all these roads that have tolls on them, and there's rivers that have, there's a giant mess. And so internal trade in France was really, really heavily regulated, and it just stymied everything. It was slow and it was expensive and all these things. So everybody agreed that they wanted to simplify the process and lift some of those barriers. Anyway, I digress. The point is that they decide that they're going to go by the medieval rules, where each estate has one vote, and the third estate wants everybody to have every delegate to have a vote. So the revolution begins when there's this guy, a clergyman. His name is Abbe, or an Abbe is he's just a member of the clergy. That's his title, Abbe, Abbe. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, okay? And Sieyès is a guy from the first estate, but he sees kind of what's happening with the third estate. They're becoming increasingly hostile and upset by the fact that they don't feel like they're being represented. So Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès says, gives this speech. He gives this amazing speech, and it really inspires the third estate, never mind the fact that he's part of the first estate. And basically, in this speech, what he suggests is that the third estate delegates, the people meeting in the Estates General on behalf of the third estate, should name themselves the National Assembly, and pass laws on behalf of the French people. Okay? So no longer even call themselves the third estate, just completely buck the entire system and call themselves the National Assembly and set up a new trend. So on June 17th, the Third Estate gets together and they vote to do exactly that. They're inspired by Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès' speech, and the members of the other estates are aware that they're starting to make some of these changes. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the French Revolution here. The French Revolution essentially has what you might call three major eras. And this is on the PowerPoint slide, but I'm just going to describe them to you right now. If you're taking notes, hopefully this makes sense to you. We're going to give them different nicknames. In fact, I'm going to nickname them based on, I didn't nickname them, I totally stole this idea, not mine, ripped it off from another teacher. I'm not the first person to put it this way. Okay, but I'll just pretend like I'm the guy that came up with it. We're going to use the names of excuse me, I've been talking all day, so my throat's really dry. We're going to use the name of philosophers to categorize the three different major eras, if you will, of the French Revolution. The first one we're going to call the Age of Montesquieu. The Age of Montesquieu. Why? Because Montesquieu was a huge fan of the British and the British government, specifically the fact that it was a constitutional monarchy, of course, which France doesn't have any sort of history with. So this first era of the French Revolution, from 1789 to 1792, is what you might call something of a moderately conservative approach to revolution. Okay? Now, some of the things I'm about to describe to you are going to sound pretty radical, not that moderate. But you'll hear why it's moderate because of the goal that they're trying to get across. Okay? In this era, you have the government system set up called the National Assembly, the one that Joseph Sieyès suggested. And this is from about 1789 to 1791. So we'll call 1789 to 1791 the Age of Montesquieu, in honor of the fact that what they're trying to achieve is a constitutional monarchy. Now, from 1791 to 1792, they have established the Constitution. See, the whole point of the National Assembly was it was always meant to be a provisional government. What that means is it was meant to be temporary. It was never meant to be long-lasting. The National Assembly simply chose to do away with the title of third estate and say, no, 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 we're the ones in charge now. We're going to make laws. And this is a temporary lawmaking body that we're going to use in order to create a constitution that we're hoping will last. A constitution that establishes France as, for the first time ever, a constitutional monarchy. Spoiler alert, the way that that turns out is that in 1791 they approve this brand new constitution and it fails miserably. Okay? Fails miserably. Within the first year they set the whole thing aside. So from about 1789 to about 1792 is this age of Montesquieu. All right? Starting in 1792, okay, the Legislative Assembly, which is what the National Assembly had renamed itself, is set aside, okay, and France enters into a brand new period known as what we'll call the Age of Rousseau. Rousseau was a guy who was in favor of, general will of the population, but he said that people ought to have a say in how things work. He was kind of a fan of representative Republican government, if you will. And so we'll say that this is the most radical, crazy phase of the revolution. And this lasts from about 1792 to about 1799. The most radical phase, though, goes from 1792 to about 1795. The early part of the Age of Rousseau is just cray-cray. So anyway, never use that word. All right, and then finally, what we might call the Napoleonic era, we'll call the Age of Voltaire. Why? Because it's much more enlightened despoty, okay? Some people call Napoleon even the last of the enlightened despots. The reason we call it the Age of Voltaire is because remember that Voltaire always thought that change would come from the top down. He was a centralized absolutist sort of a guy, but he wanted your absolute monarch to be at least enlightened, to be a man of reason, to be a person of equality and toleration and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's about 1799 to 1815 is what we'll call the Age of Voltaire. So just a quick summary. Age of Montesquieu, about 1789 to 1792. Age of Rousseau, about 1792 to about 1799. And the Age of Voltaire, which is what we might call the Napoleonic era, from about 1799 to 1815. And that categorizes the majority of this unit here into three nice, distinct, different units. All right, or different things. So anyway, let's talk a little bit. Let's get back to how the revolution began. I'm almost done here. And then you get to watch me talk for another lecture of one that I recorded a year ago. So, all right, I know a lot of lecture lately. What can I do? You know what, kids? I do this for you guys. What time is it right now? 6:45 or something like that? What am I doing? I'm working. I'm doing this for you. All right, here we go. 3 days later, meaning, okay, from June 17th, when they voted to name, the Third Estate voted to name themselves the National Assembly, 3 days later they show up to the Estates General, and the door's locked. They've been locked out of the meeting. So what they do is they go nearby, and there's like an indoor tennis court, which was actually a handball court, because tennis is, and the definition of it has changed over the last 300 years. But anyway, they break down a door to this indoor tennis court, and everybody piles in there. They got all these people in there, and they pledge that they won't leave until they get a new constitution. This is called the Tennis Court Oath, very famous event of the beginning of the French Revolution. Some nobles and clergymen who favored reform of the Third Estate joined the Third Estate, now known as the National Assembly delegates, and they start making speeches back and forth, and people are getting all crazy and riotous, and all of them end in, and we're not leaving until we get a new constitution. Meanwhile, the king is getting a little bit concerned. He hears some rumors flying around Paris, and what he does is he stations some mercenary guards from the Swiss guards, which are the same people that, by the way, guard the Vatican. Anyway, he stationaries these Swiss guards around his palace at Versailles. And rumors start flying around. Remember, Versailles is about, I don't know, 12 or 14 miles away from Paris, so it's relatively close. And rumors start flying around about the king's intentions. Ooh, why has he hired all these guards and stuff? Well, people respond to the king hiring these guards by gathering up a bunch of weapons. And the problem is that they're allowed to have these weapons, or at least some of them are allowed to have these weapons. Some of the weapons included primitive muskets and things of that nature, but most people are using like pikes, which are kind of long spear-like things, and various other types of weapons and things. And they don't have gunpowder for the guns or for the cannons, all right? So what do? They go to a place where they think they can find gunpowder, which is this old medieval prison. It actually didn't even have that many people in it anymore, but it's this old symbolism of the ancient regime, the feudalistic estates system, right? So they go to this old ancient building, this medieval castle looking thing, this prison in the middle of Paris called the Bastille, and they basically like break into it, and this angry mob gets into an argument with the commander, who refuses to like give them what they want, which I don't know why, but anyway, I think he actually even decided like maybe I'll give in, but they ended up killing him anyway. I forget how that whole story goes. You have to look it up. But anyway, they kill the commander, they chop his head off, they kill many of the guards as well. They chop his head off and they put it on a pike and they start like rioting around Paris. Things get real. And they find their gunpowder, and then they start tearing down the Bastille prison from the top down. Just, it's made out of like these giant blocks that's made out of stone, and they just start tearing the entire building down, which is like, whoa, right? Like, we were dumping tea in the harbor, they're cutting people's heads off, throwing them on pikes, parading around town, and tearing down medieval castles. I mean, it's pretty intense. So this is what became known as the storming of the Bastille. The storming of the Bastille. And to this day, this happened on July 14th, 1789. To this day, much like our own Independence Day on July 4th here in the United States, they celebrate their version of Independence Day, which is Bastille Day, which is the day that the Bastille got torn down to begin the French Revolution.